In terms of script terminology, the counter script equals the counter injunctions plus the child's acquiescence or going along with the expectations of the parent. For example, if everybody for 3 generations had been an attorney, it goes without saying you become an attorney in order to be successful. So the child doesn't get to think about, do I really want to be an attorney, or had I rather be a baseball player or an entertainer or something different? The child just goes along. I've worked with lots of physicians who at mid-career they came in for therapy because they realized they never wanted to be a doctor. That was mother or father's trip for them, not something they genuinely wanted. And they often change careers midlife. The drivers are a specific group of universal counter injunctions that all of us get to some degree, because again, they carry with them a conditional way of being okay. The script proper are the injunctions plus the child's decision, as Felipe was saying earlier. Two kids may get a don't make it injunction. One decides, I'll try as hard as I can, but I know I'll never be able to succeed. Another one decides, I'll show you I can do it even if it kills me. There's a famous story about 2 brothers whose father said, the 2 of you are going to end up in a mental institution. One became a psychiatrist, the other was a patient. So what the parents, the injunctions that they're giving out and the counter injunctions are only half of the picture. The other half is what the child decides to do in response. So parents don't script children. They give these messages and the child decides on what he or she is going to do in response. And the program, again, is the parents modeling for how to carry out the injunctions. Now, I'd like to, for those of you who wrote all the messages down, I'd like to just do an exercise for a minute to help you experience how this stuff fits together. So I'd like for you to imagine that you're somewhere around 6 years of age, give or take a couple of years, and you're getting all these messages from your parents. And just get in touch with what you're feeling emotionally as you get these messages. And then write that down. And as you're feeling that way, what do you say inside your own head about your parents, and what do you say about yourself? Like, do you say, you're really crazy, I'm all right? Or, you're right, I'm wrong? Or, you're smart, I'm dumb? Or, you're an idiot, I need to decide for myself? You know, what do you say inside your head about them, and what do you conclude about yourself? And then on the basis of what you're feeling emotionally, what you're concluding about you and them, what do you decide you're going to do as a result to try to take care of yourself in that situation? And what's your fantasy about what will happen if you do that? Yeah, on the basis of what you're feeling emotionally and what you're concluding about them and about yourself, what are you deciding you're going to do as a result to try to take care of yourself in that situation? Mm-hmm.
Find other things to do, in my case, and not compete in the areas that my mother was competitive.
Yeah. And then that way, by doing that, then what's your fantasy?
That we can both be okay and survive.
Yeah, smart kid.
Right.
It's amazing how clever kids are in figuring out a way to take care of themselves in that situation, those kinds of situations. And next, think about what your favorite fairy tale or childhood story is. And think about how it goes, what appeals to you about that story, who you identify with in the story, how it ends, and how all of that seems to fit what you're experiencing at 6, your own existential situation. Now, what I'd like for you to do next is to come back to the present and think about what keeps happening over and over again in your life now that you end up feeling the way you did at 6. And think about several things with regard to that. How does it start? What happens first? Then what happens next? And then what happens? And how does it end? And what do you feel and tell yourself at the end?
In my 6-year-old, I was still stuck in this I'm not okay place. My father was a very accomplished psychoanalyst, and the way he parented was to lecture. And so he would always say, the child part of you wants to do this, and the adult part of you still has to get this done. And just, we heard this lecture nonstop. I mean, we even would finish the darn thing for him and piss him off when he would repeat it. And so this is where I went with that 6-year-old, like literally hearing that as a 6-year-old, and being stuck with the rebellious child choosing,
right.
Hell with you, I'm going to do what I want to do because I'm a kid,
yeah,
right? And not wanting to hear this. And so that did not seem like a solution to me that brought permissions.
Right.
So I was feeling this in this moment of not kind of finding a correction, feeling that not okayness in that, just even in the process. So I was just wanted to name that,
yeah,
as a parallel.
yeah. Good example of how parents often invite the opposite response to what they're attempting to get from the child. So let me just say a word about what the questions I was asking are designed to elicit. By going back to 6 is about the age where kids have had enough experience that existentially they start trying to make sense out of all of this, what they've experienced up to that point. And they often will find a fairy tale or childhood story in which the predicament of the characters seem to existentially fit their own life. And the fantasy often is, if I can just make my life go like the fairy tale character, I too can end up living happily ever after. The feeling that we have in response to all of these messages often become what Byrne talked about as the racket, which we'll talk about this afternoon. What you conclude about your parents and about yourself is the existential position, the life position. The fairy tale offers a kind of template for how to carry out the life script. And what keeps happening over and over again in your life in the present is a reenactment of the script, which is what games are all about. It's a way of getting in touch with how you tend to play games in order to recreate the feelings and beliefs about yourself and other people and justify the script. So fairy tales are very important in other childhood stories, cartoons, Bible stories, all kinds of stories are very powerful for kids because the child will find a story that existentially fits his or her predicament. And the story gives the child a magical sense of power and control in a situation where otherwise the child would feel helpless and hopeless. So the story becomes the basic template for the individual's life script. The only problem is the story is based on magic and doesn't work in reality. So it's very helpful as a child to have a sense of power and control, but as an adult, it often leads us to try to make some magical solution come true that really won't work.
I'm struggling a little bit. I had a pretty great childhood, and I had really great parents, and I'm sort of sitting here feeling pressure to find something wrong with them and find a predicament that I can fit into this. And I mean, I'm not saying that my childhood was perfect, and I'm wondering, is this really just for examining what we struggle with, or is this also for positive scripts and for, does that make sense?
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Some of us do get positive scripts. The problem is, it's not something we chose. Like all the people who became doctors when they didn't want to become doctors. It's a very positive script, but it's not something that's ultimately satisfying for them, because they really had a desire to do something else. I have one of my wife's cousins went to Harvard and became a medical doctor and realized he never wanted to do that. Now he's teaching history and coaching soccer in a school system, and he's wonderfully happy.
When I went to my 101 with Tom and Amy Harris, it was a whole week of the 101, and they would do a marathon in the afternoon. They would do content in the morning and then personal work in the afternoon. And I didn't feel like I had any personal work to do, because I too felt like I had a happy childhood and everything was hunky-dory and it was all fine. I have discovered through the years that there were limitations to that, and I think as we evolve, we find out, so like one of my scripts is that I need somebody to help me fix things, because I never saw my father fixing things. So I think that we can start very often from, there's nothing for me to pay attention to, and I think we can evolve into that. But I think that some of us don't have any tragic scripts that are very serious. They're more banal and ordinary.
That's what I was going to say when I was talking about the three kinds. That's the case. And then also would also encourage you to think about, Sarah, the way in which cultural script message is separate from your parents. Because I was also, in my story I shared earlier, I think that there were many ways in which my parents did a good job of taking care of me in the context of the culture in which I was living, and they also sent some injunctions. My message about don't be important also came because my father, too, was an orator, and he liked to talk, and he told stories, and he taught us in that way. And sometimes when we wanted to say something about it, he would keep talking, right? So the subtle message was, listen to me, right? So it's those subtleties that we each can experience that I think that you're also thinking about, talking about.
I really enjoyed being 6, and no, like seriously, and a lot of y'all knew me when I was 6. Like I had a really nice 6-year-old time, and I loved The Little Mermaid. And I know exactly what I loved about The Little Mermaid, and like I even get the weird stuff about it, and like the things that were rebellious about me loving that and separating and all that stuff. But I also feel like, for me, like I experienced trauma when I was older that came from outside of my family that really impacted my life, and I don't understand where this fits into that.
I was going to share that my favorite childhood fairy tale was Hansel and Gretel, and I was thinking about it as I was thinking about coming here, and the new thing that I figured out about that story. I first realized that was it when the first time I ever did this. The thing I realized about it this week or 2 weeks as I've been thinking about this is that when my brother that I was talking about, when he died, a tragedy, I felt a really painful script thing to happen about being alone in a way that I had never experienced. And I just got conscious that part of how come I wanted to create community is so that I'm not feeling alone.
Right.
And so that's a new awareness that came in this last reworking of this. So again, that notion of we evolve and we peel the onion. So I really want to encourage being gentle with fitting into it, but just trying it on as a way of thinking about your own journey, and also again the journey of the folks you're going to be working with.
I was really interested to understand how trauma impacts how we, or is there a difference in how we manage trauma, or do they influence how we write a script for ourselves?
The script is a way of managing trauma.
Okay.
And, things that we experience in the present, often if you look at the earliest origin of that, it may go back to early childhood, or it may be even go back to historical trauma, cultural trauma, ancestral trauma, even past life trauma. And it, whether past lives are literal or metaphorical, it doesn't matter. If you clear up those issues, it makes a tremendous difference for you in the present life.
Can you give a few examples of how we keep, in the present, how we keep reliving that 6-year-old? Does anybody have any examples to help me understand how that?
So the one I gave earlier about when I heard Donald Trump say, "Send them back home."
Yeah.
I felt the 6-year-old in me. That's an example. There was also a town hall in Greenville, North Carolina recently, in which the crowd started yelling, "Send them back home." And it flashed for me on a night when my father came home after cross burning, and the fear that I felt. So I'm using cultural examples. You could also use personal examples, but it's when I notice the connection between something that's happening in the present and something that is old that I carry. It can be like a trip.
Right.
That's what I was talking about yesterday in the Target discount in relationships, that it will spark and take you back into your script decisions.
Yeah, thinking about that, I was just thinking my father died when I was 10, almost 11, and I didn't think it was traumatic for the longest time. And then my daughters were late teenagers, and they started to come home late, and my whole body would get like so scared. And then one day I realized, and I told them, it's not that I'm crazy, maybe I am, but that's not the reason. I realized that I had waited for my father all night long.
Oh.
And whenever they were like 2 in the morning and I didn't know where they were, all of that came back. And then the other piece is that when my brother died, also suddenly, I couldn't cry. And I'm like, in Puerto Rico, if you don't cry, you don't love the person. So I kind of had to, why am I not crying? And then about 2 weeks later, a woman I didn't know well died, and I went to her funeral because she was the sister of a friend of mine, and I was in tears. And then my sister and I were talking about it, and peer supervision helped a lot with this. And we made a contract, my brothers and my sister and I, to not show sadness because we wanted to protect our mother. So it was years later that I realized how traumatic my father's death was in a way that I never realized until later. Mm-hmm. So all this comes back in terms of things that is so unconscious, and I just react until I start thinking, where is this coming from?
Mm-hmm.
Since we're on the subject of parents dying, that was actually a question I had a little while ago about this fairy tales and childhood stories, because number 2 says that the story gives the child a magical sense of power and control. And it's so interesting, and I've been analyzing this since the moment my kids started watching cartoons, animations, is that, and I don't think it's just Disney, but I think there's a very strong storyline that always starts with the parents dying.
That's right.
Right? Like the Finding
It's
Nemo,
usually the
like
father.
Frozen, and my kids have been noticing that, and I've kind of been like, can we just skip over that front part? I mean, it's a very significant part of the story, right? So you can't. And for them, what it's created for them psychologically is this real feeling of attachment, right? A very scare about losing their parents. And so when I go away on a trip, and I think it's fairly regular, normal for kids to feel that feeling of anxiety when their parent isn't in the house and disrupts their routine and schedule. But I was just thinking it was like the opposite of this magical sense of power. It was more like it creates this fear in the kids that, and I just wonder, like, what is that about, and what is Disney or whoever is creating that storyline always? Maybe it's a Christian thing. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Kind of going back a little bit too with what Sarah and Jamila were talking about, and I feel like there are things that happened in my childhood that like I could spend a lot of time thinking about, But one script that I do feel like was really strong that didn't come from my parents, which I feel like most of my scripts didn't come from my parents, was like white beauty standards as a script, and like wanting to obey like white beauty standards. But to like also to Jamila's, the way that I have started thinking about it, and I'm wondering if this feels accurate, is I stopped thinking about the parents as parents, because I just like don't feel like my parents did a lot of telling me about my morals and values. I like witnessed it or caught it in other ways, and I'm more thinking about the parent as like this like larger monster that is like, or deity, I guess, that is all of the things that I interacted with as a young person, and like that affected me, that is not just the ways in which my parents did or did not show up.
I've just been thinking a lot about both of these questions about, do I have a script, or is it negative, or is it tragic, or is it positive? Because, and I like what Val said in terms of it's a process, and it doesn't have to be horrible. And I think we can sometimes make the best of it, and what you're talking about reminded me of that. I was thinking that my favorite fairy tale was Little Lulu, the comic book Little Lulu. And what I liked about Little Lulu was that she was, first of all, she was a girl, and then she was always fighting to try to get into the boys. The boys had a clubhouse, and they wouldn't let her in, and she was always trying to figure out, and what did that have to do with me? I was supposed to be a girl. Now, I was the fifth of 5 children, and there was a girl and 3 boys, and then they were ready for a girl for my mother's companion. And so I think I was a little Lulu trying to get into the boys' club. And then I did a lot of work, as I told you yesterday, with men. And I wrote an article called Supporting a Masculine Feminine Consciousness when the feminist movement was beginning in the 70s. And it was feeling like men were being made not okay. And I wrote an article about men are okay too, and they also are the victims of sex role stereotyping and patriarchy. They also have a negative side to that. So what occurs to me is that part of my script is it has 2 sides, 3 actually. One is making the best of it and making decisions, and that's what reminded me of what you were talking about and what you too, Sarah, were talking about. I think that there is a component to the script because I live in a family of privilege. We were landowners and so on, so there was that positive, we were okay, and that helps deal with these not okay things. And so that was one, and there were 2 others, but I forgot them. I'll tell you when I remember. But it's just a very interesting, complex thing, and I mean, we can talk about the theory, but the evolution of our own story takes time. Generally, I feel very positive about myself, and there is a component that feels very sad and scared and sad about myself, and it occurs to me that it is still apologizing. Part of my script is to still apologize for not having been a girl. So it's that combination of that it still impacts me.
Yeah.